Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're tackling a fundamental piece of American democracy, one that's definitely causing more debate lately, the U.S. Electoral College.
Yeah, it's always bubbling up, isn't it?
It really is. And you, our listener, sent us a great starting point, this article called Using Market Design to Reform the U.S. Electoral College. So that's where we'll kick things off.
That's good.
Our mission really for this deep dive is to unpack the arguments for reforming the system that are in these sources and also look at some, alternative ways of voting that people are talking about.
And the timing feels really relevant. I mean, the article brings up the 2024 election. We saw Donald Trump win the Electoral College decisively, and importantly, he also won the popular vote.
Right, but it was close on the popular vote side, wasn't it?
It was pretty slim, yeah, about 1.5%, according to the article. So while we avoided that scenario of a split outcome this time,
Yeah.
it does kind of highlight just how close the U.S. came, again, to having a president who didn't win the most individual votes.
Exactly. And the article does a good job reminding us this isn't some brand new issue. It happened more frequently, actually, in recent history than it did way back.
Mm-hmm.
You've got John Quincy Adams in 1824, Rutherford B. Hayes in 76, Grover Cleveland in 88, then more recently, George W. Bush in 2000 and Donald Trump in 2016.
Right. 5 times where the popular vote winner didn't become president.
And the authors argue that every time that happens, it chips away at the winner's legitimacy in some people's eyes.
Yeah, and potentially feeds into a bigger crisis of confidence in the whole democratic process.
Definitely.
But what's interesting about this article is the angle it takes. It's not just rehashing the same old arguments for or against the Electoral College, or just saying, let's do a popular vote. It brings in this idea of market design.
Yeah, okay. Market design.
Yeah.
That sounds maybe a little detached. When we're talking about voting, how does that concept actually apply?
Well, the authors make, I think, a pretty smart comparison. They point to other really complex systems where market design principles have worked pretty well.
Like what?
Think about how electricity markets are set up, or how they auction off licenses for, say, radio spectrum, even things like matching medical residents to hospitals.
Ah, okay. I see the connection now. Systems with lots of moving parts, specific goals.
Exactly. You've got goals you want to achieve. You've got limited resources, maybe votes, maybe spectrum, and you need rules, a mechanism to allocate things effectively, fairly. Market design is about first figuring out what you want the system to do.
Defining the objective.
Precisely. And then designing the rules to best get you there.
Okay, that makes more sense. So for elections, what would those key goals be? What are we trying to achieve?
Well, the article lays out several things like ensuring the outcome feels legitimate to people, encouraging lots of voters to actually participate.
Right. Turnout.
Turnout, yeah. And letting voters really express what they want, maybe not just picking one favorite, but showing how strongly they feel.
Intensity of preference.
That's the idea. Plus things like limiting the impact of big money, making the system understandable, transparent, making sure power changes hands peacefully.
And being flexible enough to change over time.
Yeah, adaptability. That's important too.
And the core argument seems to be that our current system, the Electoral College, well, it kind of struggles with some of those goals, especially that idea of every vote having real weight.
That's a key point. The winner-take-all system in almost all states. It means campaigns pour resources into just a handful of swing states.
Right. If you're in California or Texas for the presidential race,
your individual vote is, frankly, very unlikely to swing the state's electoral votes. The article even uses the example of a Democrat living in Austin, Texas, whose congressional district is drawn to pretty much guarantee a Republican win. That feeling of, well, what's the point? Disenfranchisement.
Yeah, that feeling that your vote just doesn't matter as much as someone's in, say, Pennsylvania or Wisconsin. And the article suggests this strategic game around the Electoral College might actually influence who even runs or who wins primaries.
That's a really critical insight, I think. The skills you need to win the Electoral College, laser focusing on those swing state margins, they aren't necessarily the same skills you need to govern the whole country effectively. So the authors worry we might end up selecting for candidates who are great campaigners under these specific rules, but maybe not the best equipped to address the nation's broader needs.
Okay, but let's talk about the elephant in the room. Changing it. The Constitution. That seems like a monumental task, right?
Oh, absolutely huge.
Especially as the article notes, if the current setup arguably benefits one party more often in recent years, they point to the Republican Party. getting everyone to agree to change the rules of the game.
Is incredibly difficult. You need that supermajority in Congress, plus ratification by 3/4 of the states. It's a very, very high hurdle.
So is it just impossible then?
Well, this is where the market design perspective offers maybe a more pragmatic path, amending the Constitution.
Yeah.
Tough. But the principles of market design, thinking about goals, rules, outcomes, you can apply those elsewhere.
Like at the state level or at local elections.
Exactly. State, local, even presidential primaries. Those could be places to experiment to try out different rules based on these design principles.
Okay, so let's dive into that. If we're thinking beyond the current system, maybe starting smaller, what alternative voting rules are out there? What does the article suggest?
It covers quite a few interesting ones. The first one, probably most familiar to people, is ranked choice voting.
RCV.
Right, RCV. We hear about that more now. Places like Alaska, Maine, they're already using it.
They are.
Could you just quickly break down how it works for anyone listening who isn't quite sure?
Sure. Basically, instead of just picking one candidate, you rank them. This is my first choice, this is my second, my third, and so on.
Okay.
If someone gets over 50% of the first choice votes right away, boom, they win. Simple. But if nobody gets majority,
Then the candidate with the fewest first-place votes is eliminated. And if you voted for that eliminated candidate,
your vote isn't wasted.
exactly, your vote automatically goes to your next highest-ranked choice who's still in the running. They repeat that process, eliminate the lowest, redistribute votes until one candidate crosses that 50% threshold.
So the big arguments for it are, one, it reduces that spoiler problem, right? Where voting for a third party might help the person you dislike most.
Yeah, that's a major goal.
And two, it might push candidates to seek broader support, try to be voters' second or third choice, not just energize their base.
That's the hope. But, the article's also pretty grounded. It looks at how RCV has actually worked in practice and points out it's not always a magic bullet.
What did they find?
Well, take that 2022 special election in Alaska. Even with RCV, more than a quarter of the voters, over 26%, they only ranked one candidate.
Oh, really? That's interesting. So they didn't use the ranking option much?
It suggests just changing the rules on the ballot doesn't instantly change how everyone votes or thinks about voting. Habits are sticky.
And candidate behavior, too.
Seems like it. The article mentions that in the 2024 primary for that same Alaska House seat, some candidates actually dropped out before the election, seemingly to consolidate votes within their party, even though RCV was in place.
Huh. So the old two-party strategic thinking still kind of dominates sometimes.
It can, yeah. The system is deeply ingrained.
And the article also mentioned there's even some debate within the RCV world about the best way to run it, something about how you eliminate candidates.
Right, this gets a little technical, but it's actually pretty important. The common method, instant runoff, or the Hare system, eliminates based on who has the fewest first-place votes.
Yeah.
The potential problem there, and this is something voting theorists worry about, is that you could accidentally eliminate someone called a Condorcet winner.
A condor what?
A Condorcet winner. It's basically a candidate who would beat every other single candidate if you put them head-to-head in a series of one-on-one matchups.
Ah, okay. So a candidate a lot of people might find acceptable, even if they aren't everyone's top choice.
Exactly. And the instant runoff method could knock that person out early. There's an alternative called Borda's elimination rule, which eliminates based on the fewest total votes across all rankings. That method, the research suggests, avoids eliminating a Condorcet winner.
So the specific nuts and bolts of how you count the ranked votes really matters. It could change the outcome.
It absolutely can. The details are crucial.
Wow. Okay, and it's telling that we're seeing RCV pop up on ballots this November in places like Colorado, Idaho, Nevada, Oregon, even D.C. The conversation is definitely happening.
It is. The experimentation phase is clearly underway. Now, the article also explores some other ideas, maybe less common ones, like quadratic voting and storable votes.
Quadratic voting, storable votes. Okay, these sound different.
They are. They're trying to get at that idea we mentioned earlier, preference intensity. How much do you care?
Right. Okay, quadratic voting. Break that down for me. Sounds complex.
It does sound a bit like math homework, yeah?
Huh.
But the core idea, you get a budget of vote credits. Casting one vote for a candidate costs, say, 1 credit, but your second vote for that same candidate costs 4 credits. Your third vote costs 9 credits.
Ah, so the cost goes up quadratically, like 1 squared, 2 squared, 3 squared.
Precisely. So you could vote multiple times for someone you feel strongly about, but it gets expensive fast in terms of your credits.
What's the point of that?
It allows you to signal strong support for your top priorities, but it naturally limits anyone, even someone wealthy, if credits were somehow linked to money, though usually they aren't from just dominating by casting tons of votes. That exponential cost makes it inefficient.
Okay, so it lets you weigh your votes, but with a built-in check. What about storable votes?
Similar concept, different mechanism. Imagine you could save your vote from an election you don't care much about.
Like skip voting for local dog catcher this year.
Maybe, yeah. And then use that saved vote, plus your regular vote in the next election that you feel is really critical, maybe the governor's race or a big referendum.
So you accumulate voting power for the races that matter most to you.
Exactly. You get a pool of influence, and you decide where to deploy it.
Fascinating. What does the article see as the main pros and cons of these kinds of systems?
Well, the big pro is potentially getting around the tyranny of the majority, where a bare majority might steamroll the strong preferences of a large minority. These systems give that minority a way to signal intensity.
And limit undue influence.
Potentially, yes, because raw resources don't translate directly into overwhelming voting power due to the increasing costs or fixed budgets.
Oh,
But
there's always a but?
there's always a but. The downside is complexity. They're definitely harder to explain and maybe harder for voters to use strategically than just casting one vote. Simplicity and transparency could take a hit.
Yeah, I could see people being a bit wary of the math or the strategy involved. Are there simpler alternatives mentioned?
Yes, definitely. The article discusses approval voting and majority judgment as simpler ways to get more preference information than our current system.
Okay, approval voting. How's that work?
Super simple, actually. You look at the list of candidates, and you can approve of basically give a thumbs up to as many of them as you want.
Oh, so not ranking, just yes or no for each one.
Exactly. Candidate A,
Yep.
Candidate B, nope. Candidate C, yep. And the winner is just the person who gets the most approvals overall.
What are the supposed benefits there?
The article suggests it could lead to less negative campaigning. If you need broad approval, maybe you don't want to alienate the supporters of other candidates too much.
Makes sense. You want to be likable enough to get that second or third choice approval.
Right. And it also helps with the spoiler effect, because you can approve of your favorite and another acceptable candidate without worrying your vote is wasted.
Okay, that one seems pretty straightforward. What about majority judgment?
A bit more involved than approval, but still based on evaluation, not just ranking. Voters grade each candidate on a common scale.
Like giving them a report card, A, B, C, D.
Something like that, yeah. Could be excellent, good, fair, poor, unacceptable. And the winner isn't the one with the highest average grade, but the one with the highest median grade.
Median.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, the middle grade when you line them all up. Why median?
Using the median makes the system more resistant to strategic voting and can avoid some mathematical paradoxes that sometimes pop up in ranked systems. It gives a really robust sense of the typical evaluation for each candidate.
So it allows for more nuanced judgment than just approve, disapprove.
Exactly. You're giving each candidate a richer evaluation. The article sees strengths in both approval and majority judgment. They could boost participation. They're relatively easy to grasp, especially approval.
But
But they don't directly tackle that issue of big money in politics. That's maybe a separate challenge.
got it. Now, the article also briefly touches on some more radical ideas, doesn't it?
It does throw a few really different concepts out there.
Like what? Give us a flavor.
Well, one is compulsory voting, making it mandatory, like in Australia.
Right. Everyone has to vote.
That would certainly crank up turnout numbers, no question.
Mm.
But the article acknowledges the pushback, arguments about personal freedom, whether forcing people who aren't engaged actually leads to better outcomes.
Yeah, that's a whole philosophical can of worms right there. What else?
Another really out there idea is changing how we draw districts. Forget geography for a minute. What if districts were based on the first letter of your last name?
Wait, what? Like everyone whose name starts with S is in one district, T is in another?
That's the kind of idea floated by economists like Stephen Landsberg. The thinking is it makes it almost impossible for politicians to pander to narrow local interests or for lobbyists to target specific geographic areas.
Because your constituents are scattered all over the place, connected only by a letter.
Exactly. You couldn't promise a new bridge just for the S district. But obviously the article notes a big potential downside. Would voters feel any connection at all to a representative chosen that way? Does it undermine legitimacy in a different way?
Yeah, that feels pretty abstract. Interesting thought experiment, though. Any others?
Briefly, yeah. The idea of letting people aggregate votes, maybe through interest groups.
Yeah.
So if you really care about the environment, maybe you allocate more of your voting power towards environmental groups or candidates focused there.
Directing your influence towards your priorities.
Kind of like that, yeah. And finally, it nods to technology, how modern tech could enable more sophisticated or secure voting, but always balanced with that critical need for transparency and auditability. Voting experts always stress that you need to be able to check the results.
Absolutely. Okay, so stepping back from all these different methods, RCV, quadratic, approval, the wonder ideas, what's the main takeaway from the article's market design approach?
I think the core message is, let's get beyond just arguing about the Electoral College versus a national popular vote as the only two options. That's too simplistic.
Right, it's not a binary choice.
No. We should think like designers. First, let's really nail down what we want our election system to do. What are the goals? Fairness, legitimacy, participation, preference expression, all that stuff.
And then look at the tools.
Exactly. Then be willing to explore and, crucially, experiment with different voting rules, different mechanisms to see which ones actually help us achieve those goals best in the real world.
And the emphasis is really on starting small, isn't it? State and local level first.
Very much so. Try things out in cities, in states, gather actual data. How does RCV affect turnout in this city? Are voters more satisfied with approval voting in that state? Learn from experience before even thinking about massive national changes.
And those lessons learned locally could also feed back into reforming primaries.
That's a key connection the article makes. Presidential primaries, as they're currently run with complex delegate allocation rules for both parties, might actually be contributing to polarization.
How so?
Well, the rules in many primaries can incentivize candidates to appeal strongly to the most ideological or activist wings of their party to win delegates early on.
Playing to the base to win the nomination.
Right. So you might end up with nominees who are further apart politically than the average voter. The article suggests that experimenting with different primary rules, maybe informed by market design principles or lessons from state-level general election reforms, could potentially produce candidates with broader appeal from the get-go.
So if you had, say, RCV and primaries, candidates might need to appeal beyond just the hardcore base to get those second and third choice votes to secure the nomination.
That's the kind of possibility worth exploring, yeah. The hope is that better designed elections, not just for president but all the way down, could lead to candidates who are maybe better equipped to bridge divides and represent a wider range of interests.
So it's less about finding one perfect system immediately.
And more about embracing an ongoing process. Discussion, experimentation, learning, adapting, building an electoral system that actually reflects voters' interests and keeps up as society evolves.
A process of evolution, not revolution. That's a really helpful frame. And maybe the thought to leave our listeners with is, how can you engage with these kinds of discussions happening in your own state or city? Because those local experiments might just shape the future of how we choose leaders at all levels, including the presidency. It brings the power back closer to home, doesn't it?
It really does. It suggests change can bubble up from the ground level.